Welcome to the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel, where we are opening up our hearts, mind, and souls to explore the challenges, barriers, and opportunities available to leaders who are creating safe and inclusive spaces. With Sabrina, Shadie, ethics and equity specialist, and Charlotte Hopkins, learning and development expert, together, along with our guest experts, we will be sharing our own personal journeys, inspirational stories, and top tips on how we are becoming allies that tackle stigma, prejudice, and discrimination head on. Welcome back to the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel. If you haven't already done so, please don't forget to click subscribe. We're on episode 4. And this week, we're really excited to be digging into a topic that is something really close to both Sabrina and my heart. It's something that's really current. It's something that's been long overdue to be discussed, and it's 100% needed. We're going to be talking about privilege. So,
hi. Oh, go on. I was going to say hi. I'm Sabrina. My background is equality, diversity, and inclusion consultancy. People say expert. It's not a word that I like because it is so closely linked to the topic we're going to be sharing today. And privilege. By saying I'm an expert, you put yourself up here somewhere, like above everyone else. And actually, for me, when we talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion, we're actually talking about lived experience. So I can't have an expertise in every single aspect of that. But I am very privileged in the fact that I A, have a lot of lived experience, B, have a lot of professional experience. And in addition, I've been very privileged to have people around me who have allowed me to use those experiences to build a career or to build my business and to talk about the things that I've lived through, that I've experienced and that I've seen. And I know not everyone gets that opportunity, so I recognise it as a privilege. And I think that's where a lot of people get undone when we start using the words like privilege. They see it something to be a defense. Oh, I'm not privileged. I didn't, have a silver spoon. I'm not, when you look at royalty and talk about that level of privilege, that's kind of out of the reach of most of us. But I feel, when you talk about things like gratitude and recognition of the opportunities that are afforded to you, you can start looking at the privileges you do have, like the things, the opportunities you've got that maybe somebody else in a very similar position wouldn't have had. And I think that's a game changer when we're looking at our responsibility in terms of how we support others to enable our privilege to help them.
Yeah, I love talking about this topic, which 3 years ago didn't even know that I had a huge amount of privilege. And I'm being a bit flippant when I say that, actually. So, when we use that definition of privilege and that understanding that we have advantages, I guess, we got more advantages and more in our favour as human beings compared to other human beings to kind of move forward. And my professional background's worked, within the drug and alcohol sector. So I've worked with lots of people who've got lots and lots of vulnerabilities, lots of disadvantages, lots of complex needs. So I've always been really aware of the privilege that I have. And somebody recently asked me, actually, what's your greatest privilege? And I was one of those that said, I've got hot food on my table every day, that I've got some money in my bank account, that I've got, security and safety. So when we look at the very basic fundamental human needs, then I absolutely can see that I have huge amounts of privilege. I think when we start to overlap it with EDI and we start to talk about inclusion and diversity and equality and equity and all of those things that we talked about in episode 2, FYI, if you haven't listened already, then there's something really interesting to me that I did not see as a white female who would class herself as middle class, who's Welsh. So, we definitely have the Welsh rugby game playing tomorrow, so there'll definitely be some banter bantered about. But I find the whole idea of privilege in the EDI space has been something that I hadn't really taken into mind. So yeah, I'm really excited to just dig a little bit into that aspect of it, because I think it's a really important part as a white person in particular, but a white, able-bodied, no kind of diagnosis of mental health, whether, hidden or not. There's there's, you know, I have a pretty much a box all of my own where I don't have many disadvantages. And I don't think I really appreciated that until a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I think the bit you said around, you know, I've got hot food, I've got a roof, I've got security, my family are healthy, da, da, da. When we talk about EDI, I love to start at the kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
And when we talk about privilege, it's a really easily accessible visual for people. So please feel free, you know, go and Google Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
It's a nice little sort of pyramid triangle shape, and at the bottom you've got all of these physical needs, the things that we need for our bodies to actually be alive. So food, water,
oxygen,
air, that kind of
real
basic stuff. And then as you go up the pyramid, you know, each level becomes, you know, more about maybe security and belonging and your connection with other human beings and that kind of stuff. But that bottom layer is really, really key when we start talking about privilege.
Yeah.
I've worked with public sector young, you know, diversity since 2000 actually. And one of the key elements working with disadvantaged young people from all different backgrounds, but people who are considered, you know, they're excluded from school or they're young offenders or they're whatever, so they're on a level of sort of vulnerability and disadvantage. There are a few key things that you look at. So you look at housing, you know, have they got secure housing? If you haven't, and you've been in sort of transient, whether it's short-term rentals with your family or whether it's hostels, or that is a massive detraction from your level of privilege. If you haven't got a stable home, if you haven't got regular meals, you know, we've seen the breakfast clubs in schools, you know, and the food poverty happening in the UK currently. So all these things are really clear markers of privilege. If you've never had to worry about, am I going to get to eat breakfast today?
Yeah.
That's a privilege.
Yeah, I always use the example of, for any new parents listening or any parents of puppies, that kind of thing. I always think that my biggest example is I'm probably not the most patient person when I'm sleep deprived. I don't make the best decisions when I'm hungry. I might have, and I've lived in accommodation where there was long-term rental, but it didn't feel safe and secure. So my cortisol levels were elevated all the time. So when we look at that, I love Maslow, and I know there's kind of lots of discussions around Maslow and whether it's fit for purpose anymore. But for me, it really, really is, because when I'm sleep deprived, when I'm hungry, I am just very irritable. I think my husband.
And that's a really thin end of the wedge when we talk about that stuff. If you imagine now a family who have been in temporary housing for 5+ years, their children actually don't know what it's like to have a bedroom of their own, and you've got 5 people living in what is effectively a 2-room accommodation as part of a hostel environment. So there's no space to go and do homework. You know, you're working on the bed, you're eating your dinner on the bed, and all of that stuff. And we've seen it happen. And even as a parent working from that environment, how good are you going to be focusing on your job and being productive in your job if you know you've got to go home and try and cook and provide for your children in that kind of environment? So it's really easy when you look at Maslow to unpick, actually, I don't have to worry about those things. I have a secure home. I have, you know, a car that allows me to go right. I don't have to wait for a taxi or a bus or other public transport or a lift to get where I need to go. My health is generally pretty good. I don't have hospital appointments and stuff to try and organize. All of these things allow us to be privileged. And that's without talking about the ethnicity elements or the, you know, significant disability elements or any of the other protected characteristics. That's just day-to-day life. If we can unpick the what's the word, defensiveness around privilege, it's not saying that you're really lucky and everything's beautiful for you. It's saying you don't have to worry about these you know, day-to-day quality of life struggles that a lot of our society currently are facing. You know, paying bills, covering the rent, and so on and so forth. They are things, you know, that so many people are facing. And if you don't have that hanging over your head every day, you're very privileged.
you can make just different decisions.
Massively.
People talk all the time about money, and money's has got that kind of interesting emotional connotation, hasn't it? And I don't think it really matters anymore what political party you believe in, or really what part of the country you're in. That north-south divide isn't necessary, certainly from a Welsh perspective, and then being London centric, it's very, very different. So when we look at, there's lots and lots of similarities, and I think that's the bit that people struggle with this term privilege, because with Maslow, it's really relatable. We can relate to that. We can relate to probably being a little bit hungry and being a little bit irritated. But if I'm entirely honest, I can't relate to somebody who's not eaten for days and days and days. I can relate to somebody who's thinking, I'm like minus 30K in debt. How am I going to feed my child? And I remember when I first met my now husband, he turned up kind of on our fourth date. Like the first time he came to our house for food, and I had to feed Lauren first and then me and him, because I didn't have 3 spoons and forks. So when I look at that relatability to people who have extreme debt and are financially stressed, I can really relate to that. And he turned up on our fifth date. He brought cutlery and crockery for me. So he came in with 2 bags of food and cutlery and crockery, because we literally had nothing. However, I could really recognize that privilege to a certain point, because I had family around me. I had my mum saving her boots cards to buy nappies for my child. So, I had that support. What I find really particularly interesting, I'd like us to dig a little bit more into, because I think this is where the bit really kind of starts to hit home, is what I can't necessarily relate to is the systemic privilege. And we've talked lots about this outside of this podcast. So I know that it's a topic that we, kind of have lots of shared values for, but also you've definitely held a safe space for me to really unpick what that looks like. I just think it'd be really valuable just for us to dig in a little bit around what that systemic privilege looks like and how we can recognize it a little bit in ourselves, really.
Yeah, so some of the key ones, I do a workshop around privilege for people, and there's some questions that we ask just to help people identify how they might score on that privilege, level of status if we were to do one. And it's things like how educated are your parents? Did they finish school? Did they go to college? Did they go to university? How many people within your family, older generations, own their property? Do your parents own the house they live in, together or individually? Grandparents, did they own their property? And so on and so forth. Because those kinds of sort of land ownership, I know our houses don't really come with land these days, but the principles of land ownership,
too big.
Yeah, and really expensive. Buying houses is mad, because you've got to have thousands of pounds to put down. You've got to have thousands of pounds income just to get a mortgage. So all of these kinds of things, they don't feel like a privilege, but actually they lead to being in a better place for the next generation. And privilege is very much about that legacy.
Yes, yeah.
If historically your family have been well enough off that, there's been consistency of employment, there's been consistency of housing, there's been consistency of income. These things all set you up.
Yeah.
Your grandparents and parents' hard work sets you up, which is exactly what we want, in society.
Yeah.
For your quality of life, and then for you to pass it on to your children.
Yeah.
When you recognize that, and then recognize that some groups have been excluded from that, so have been unable to have land ownership in their own name, for example, have unfavorable financial access, things like that will impact their ability to pass on any benefits to their legacies, to their children. A good example is, women didn't have rights to own land for such a long time, that all of the family wealth would always go to the eldest son. Even if there were daughters older than him, they would be ignored and it would go to the boy. That's a really obvious issue around people's rights and people's access to long-term legacy and privilege. So that understanding that, I'm really lucky. I come from a mixed heritage family. My white granddad took a lot of energy into investing in me, to help me in my academic, to make, because I loved reading, I always loved reading. He took me, he was he worked for the Open University, and he took me to the Open University library when I was little. Like, I wasn't even in senior school.
Oh,
And it was like, that Beauty and the Beast moment when she walks into the library, like,
love the smell of dirty books. I love a library.
I mean, I'm book crazy, right? So, and granddad fed that, and that was a privilege for me, to have a grandparent who works in an environment, an academic environment, and really recognized and understood and invested in me, because he saw that in me as well. That is a privilege. Having those kind of accesses, which a little brown girl from a council estate normally wouldn't have. That's a massive privilege, right?
And I think it's the mindset as well, isn't it? And I think this is really interesting, because I was definitely of the belief, even though I worked within the kind of space I worked within, I was definitely of that sense that everybody's got the same opportunities. And I do believe that to a certain extent, but what I didn't really appreciate was how many steps they were to climb before you got to that level playing field. And I think that's the challenge that I think lots of, and I'm going to say it, white people in particular, able-bodied people in particular, people without mental ill health in particular, the mindset of somebody who has privilege embedded and ingrained and indoctrinated in our psyche is a very different mindset to somebody who doesn't have that. And I think a money mindset is a really classic example of that. But I think just the ability to access resources, I know just within Wales, which is, a good proportion, I would say 3/4 of Wales is on the water. So we have beaches. There are plenty of children, young people within Wales where they've never accessed the beach or really understood farming. And I think that really showcases the privilege difference, I feel, in a mindset of you can just grab a train or I can't afford a train. Those two things are very, very different.
I think there's, again, the visual for me is like a ladder when we talk about privilege, and the ladder rungs are really close together for people with privilege. It's easy to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 and just up the ladder. For people where privilege is not part of their day-to-day life, where they have a lot more hardships or a lot more challenges, the rungs of the ladder are much further apart, so they have much further to go to access whatever the next step is, and to the resilience and strength they need to pull themselves to the next phase. And it can be as simple as not having to think about things. So I had a really interesting conversation with a guy recently who is all of the white, probably upper middle class, very socioeconomically ahead in a lot of ways, very well educated, works in the city, blah 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 blah, but is EDI passionate. And he put a post up about his journey has never included having to worry about being stopped by the police. But yet he has a colleague who is black but has all the same qualifications, all the same status, but gets stopped on a regular basis going into the city to work. And he's like, there's literally no comparative difference other than the color of our skin. He says, and recognizing that, having that conversation with him just blew my mind, because I would never have to consider I need to leave a little bit earlier because I might get stopped by police and I don't want to be late for my meeting.
Absolutely.
Why I would never have to think like that. And it's those privileges. That's a privilege. I don't have to think about the potential of getting stopped by the police on my way to work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm involved in a project in Cardiff at the moment called City for All, and part of the challenge that they're doing a lot of work with to get the Cardiff City ready for the wheelchair rugby World Cup, which is coming this year in May.
We're in 2023 already.
I know, we are already in 2023. So part of the project is to build this legacy, and it's all about this legacy for all and how we make the city accessible. And I really hadn't appreciated the additional time needed, the fact that people would turn up and there would be nobody to let them off the trains, even though it had been pre-planned. And I think that's those simple things that we just take for granted. And that term, oh, I just didn't see it, I find really interesting, because I wonder how many more stories we need to hear from lived experience before we start to see the privilege that we have. And I do think part of, the narrative of change the balance is all about flipping that over, isn't it? It's not about saying there's discrimination. We know there's discrimination. We know there's prejudice. We know there's disadvantage. It's actually about flipping that over and saying, yeah, but where's your advantage? Where do you not get discriminated? So where is your privilege? How can you be better? And our next podcast episode is all about allyship, which is a really important part of moving the conversation forward.
Conversations to the next phase, yeah.
But having those conversations to be able to just allow yourself to step back and go, yeah, I can see that. I hadn't seen it before. And that's okay. I hadn't seen it before, but now I do. Now exactly. I do better.
And yeah, I mean, Maya Angelou has a great quote around that, doesn't she? Like, once you know better, you can do better, and all of that.
Yeah.
And I think an activity that we've done with young people in the past, we've printed off a Maslow, but in just the outlines, and then we've got them to colour in sections, as if they've got it, so they can see where their gaps are. They don't have to share it with anybody, but it's a good exercise to do. Like, maybe go and have a look and consider how many of those base blocks you've got in terms of kind of, and all the way up the kind of pyramid. See where your gaps are, and then consider how you might approach that, but actually see where you don't have gaps. That's a real privilege, and understanding that allows you to go, okay, so how can I open the door for other people where I've got this space, I've got this opportunity, but they don't? So how do I open the door and enable them to come through with me? And I think that's kind of leading into the next podcast, because that's the key part for allyship.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of finish up then, I definitely think that's a brilliant activity for anybody who's really looking to understand where their privilege might sit, to just Google Maslow and you'll find tons and tons and tons of charts, and really think about where you are and what you have within that, and maybe what's stopping you. Is there something that's stopping you go up that tier, or actually are you finding you're smashing that, and you might not have all of this down the bottom, but you are on your journey to self-mastery? So when you look at that, I think is a really beautiful activity. So I would definitely recommend people have a look at that, and of course then join us for episode 5, where we will be talking about allyship, what it is, how we can become a better ally, and what that next step needs to be. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited for you to be here. Make sure, as we say, you press subscribe, and we'll see you for the next episode.
Thank you.